The moment I heard my daughter's voice on the other end of the line, I knew. She wasn't asking about the weather. She wasn't calling to check in. She said the words we had agreed upon 3 years ago. Words that were supposed to be a joke. Words I had prayed I would never actually hear spoken in that particular tone, in that particular sequence. She said, "Dad, I think I left my blue scarf at your place. We don't have a code word. We have a sentence. And she doesn't own a blue scarf." I was sitting in my kitchen in Guelph, Ontario, finishing what was left of a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. It was a Thursday in late November, the kind of evening where the sky goes dark before 5 o'clock and the wind off the fields cuts right through whatever you're wearing. I was 63 years old, retired, and according to my son-in-law, essentially useless. That's not quite how he said it, of course. Men like him never say things quite how they mean them. He would smile and make comments about how nice it must be to have nothing but time on your hands, or ask in front of company whether I'd managed to figure out the new TV remote yet. Small things. The kind of things that are too small to call out without looking like you can't take a joke. He was good at that. His name was Corey, and he had married my daughter Claire 4 years earlier at a small ceremony outside of Hamilton. I had walked her down the aisle myself. Her mother had passed from ovarian cancer 2 years before that. And I want to be clear about something. I am not a man who falls apart easily. I spent 22 years with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the last 11 of them in plainclothes, working organized crime files that I still can't discuss in full detail. I have sat across tables from people who did things to other people that I will carry with me until I die. I know what compose looks like because I had to wear it every single day for most of my adult life. But walking Claire down that aisle without her mother there, that was the hardest thing I have ever done. I liked Corey well enough at the beginning. He was a project manager for a construction company out of Burlington, made decent money, seemed to have his life in order. He was confident, maybe too confident for my taste, but I was willing to call that ambition. He spoke loudly at dinner parties and interrupted people occasionally, but I told myself that was just his personality. I had seen enough of the world to know that minor irritations in a person's social manner don't necessarily reflect what they're like behind closed doors. I was wrong about that, or rather, I was right about it, and I chose not to look closely enough. There were signs, if I'm honest. The way Claire would hesitate before answering simple questions when he was in the room. The way she laughed a half-second too late at things, like she was waiting to see his reaction first. Once, at Thanksgiving, this was 2 years into the marriage. She came out of the kitchen with a dish, and her hands were shaking slightly, not a lot. Just enough that I noticed. When I caught her eye, she gave me a smile that was about 90% performance and 10% her. I filed it away. I told myself I was projecting. I told myself she would come to me if something was wrong. That's the thing about people who love their children. They want to believe the story with the better ending. What I didn't know then, and what Claire told me much later, was that Corey had already begun the slow work of making her feel like she had nowhere to go. It started with small corrections, the way she cooked, the friends she kept in contact with. Then came the money. He had gradually shifted things so that all the household finances ran through his account, and Claire's salary from her job as a dental hygienist was deposited into a joint account that he effectively controlled. By the time I started paying closer attention, she had been operating for over a year in a situation where she had almost no financial independence and no clear way out that she could see. She hadn't told me any of this because she was embarrassed, and because he had been very careful to make her feel like it was her fault, and because she genuinely believed, for a while, that if she just tried harder, things would get better. I understood all of that later. In the moment, sitting at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, all I understood was, my daughter had said the sentence. I was in my truck in less than 90 seconds. I want to explain something about the code before I go further, because I know it sounds dramatic. It doesn't feel dramatic when you set it up. It feels like something you hope to God you're being paranoid about. I had suggested it to Claire about 3 years earlier, during a period when I was starting to feel uneasy, but couldn't articulate why. I framed it casually. I said, "Look, I spent 22 years in law enforcement. I've seen situations turn bad fast, humor an old man. We picked a phrase together, something that would never come up naturally in conversation. Something she could say in front of someone else without it sounding like anything. If she ever used it, I would come immediately, no questions, no calling back, just come. She thought I was being overprotective. She agreed to it mostly to make me feel better. She used it on a Thursday evening in November, when Corey had come home from a work event, having clearly had more to drink than he should have, and the argument that started in the kitchen had moved into the living room, and his voice had gotten to a volume and a pitch that frightened her, in a way that previous arguments hadn't. Their son, Liam, who was 4 years old, and whose name I haven't mentioned yet because he had been at my daughter's friend Britt's house for the afternoon, and I want to be precise about the timeline, was being dropped off within the hour. She called me from the bathroom. I drove the 40 minutes to their place in Ancaster in 31 minutes. I know that because I checked the time when I pulled out of my driveway, and I checked it again when I turned onto their street. I am not going to describe what I was feeling during that drive, because some things are not easy to put into words, and because what I was feeling is not really the point of this story. What matters is that I was focused. I had spent over 2 decades learning to set emotion aside and do the job in front of me. That training doesn't leave you. It waits. The lights in the front room were on. I could hear raised voices before I reached the front door. I didn't knock. Claire had given me a key years ago, when they first moved in, for emergencies. Corey had mentioned once, with that particular smile of his, that it was a bit unusual for a father-in-law to have a house key. I had smiled back and said I thought it was pretty standard. We had left it there. I used the key. The scene inside was this. Claire was backed against the far wall of the living room. She hadn't been hit. I want to be clear about that. But Corey was standing close enough to her and at an angle that I recognized immediately. I had seen that geometry in enough rooms, over enough years, to know exactly what it meant. It was the geometry of someone who had decided he was the only thing in the space that mattered. He heard the door and turned around. I closed the door behind me and stood in the entrance without saying anything. He stared at me for a moment. I was wearing what I'd grabbed on the way out. An old flannel jacket, work boots, jeans. I hadn't shaved in 3 days. I am not a large man, but I have spent years being told I have a particular way of standing in a room. Corey had apparently never noticed it before, or had never had occasion to take it seriously. "What the hell?" he started. "Claire," I said, without taking my eyes off him. "Go to the kitchen and call Britt. Tell her you're coming to pick up Liam and that you'll probably be staying there tonight. Take your time, pack what you need." She moved. He moved to stop her. I stepped between them. I'll keep the specifics brief, not because I'm trying to be vague, but because what happened in the next few minutes was not complicated and it was not dramatic in the way that physical confrontations are sometimes described. He came at me with the confidence of a man who had decided he was dealing with a 63-year-old retiree who had no idea what he was doing. He was wrong about that. I had him on the ground in a matter of seconds, face down, my knee between his shoulder blades, his right arm controlled. He was not injured. He was, however, completely unable to move, and I think the shock of that, the gap between who he thought I was and what was actually happening, was more disorienting to him than anything physical. I had already called 911 on the drive over and given them the address. I had identified myself and my former service number and explained the situation clearly. The 2 officers who arrived were from Hamilton Police Service. One of them, when he saw me, stopped and said, "Sir, were you on the job?" I told him I'd been with the RCMP for 22 years. He nodded in a way that required no further explanation. They took Corey out. He went quietly, which surprised me a little and probably shouldn't have. Men like that are often very good at adjusting their behavior the moment an audience changes. I found Claire in the kitchen. She had been crying but was holding herself together with the particular dignity that she has had since she was a child. The kind of composure you can't teach someone. They either have it or they don't. Liam was on his way. She had already texted Britt. I sat down at their kitchen table, a kitchen table that I had never sat at without Corey being present, I realized. And for a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she said, "I didn't know if you'd actually come." I looked at her. "Claire, we set up the code." "I know," she said. I didn't know if it would feel real." I understood what she meant. There's a difference between knowing something in theory and watching it happen. She had believed, somewhere underneath everything, that when the moment came there would be some reason it wouldn't work. Some reason she would still be on her own. "How long?" I asked. She knew what I was asking. She looked at the table for a long moment. 2 years, she said. Maybe a little more. It didn't start all at once. It just kept getting smaller. That's the thing about this kind of situation that people who haven't been close to it often don't understand. There's rarely a single moment where everything shifts. It's a slow accumulation. The space gets smaller so gradually that by the time you realize you can't breathe, you've almost forgotten what breathing freely felt like. We talked for a long time that night. I found out about the finances, about the way he had structured things so that she had access to money only through him, the way he had made her feel incompetent about managing it, even though she had been managing her own finances just fine before they married. I found out that she had almost called me 6 months earlier, had sat with her phone in her hand for 20 minutes, and then put it down because she couldn't figure out what she would even say. "You could have said anything," I told her. "You could have called and just talked about nothing and I would have figured it out." She smiled at that. Not the performance smile. The real one. Liam came home that night with Britt dropping him off, a 4-year-old who was proud of himself for having helped Britt's kids feed their rabbit, and who wanted to tell us about it in exhaustive detail. I sat at that kitchen table and listened to every word of it. He was wearing a little blue fleece jacket with a hockey logo on it, and his boots were on the wrong feet. And he sat on his mother's lap and told us about the rabbit, while his mother held him like she was making up for lost time. I stayed until after he was in bed. In the weeks that followed, there were practical things to deal with. Claire needed a family lawyer, and I helped her find a good one in Hamilton who had experience with exactly this kind of situation. Financial control, documentation of the pattern of behavior, the question of what Corey's ongoing access to Liam would look like. These things are never simple. They are slow, and they require patience, and they cost money and emotional energy that people who are already exhausted don't have much of. I helped where I could. I drove her to appointments. I stayed on the phone when she needed to talk through things at 11 at night. Corey, to no one's surprise, hired a lawyer, and initially tried to characterize what had happened as me having broken into the house and assaulted him unprovoked. The responding officer's report told a somewhat different story. Claire's account told a different story. The evidence of the financial arrangement, once her lawyer started pulling it apart, told a very different story. He eventually stopped pushing that particular narrative. I am not going to tell you that everything resolved cleanly, because life doesn't work that way, and I'm not interested in telling a story that isn't true. The separation was hard. There were months where Claire was managing more than any person should have to manage at once. The legal process, her job, her son, her own processing of what she had been through. There were nights she called me sounding like she was barely keeping her head above water. And I would drive to Ancaster and sit with her, or take Liam for the afternoon so she could rest. There was one evening in the spring, about 4 months after that November night, when I picked Liam up from daycare and we stopped at a Tim Hortons on the way back to Claire's place. He got a chocolate Timbit and a small apple juice, and he sat across from me in a booth and told me very seriously that he wanted to be a firefighter, but also maybe a dinosaur scientist, and he hadn't decided yet. I told him both seemed like excellent plans. He had Corey's jaw and Claire's eyes, and he was 4 years old, and he had no idea that the last several months had been anything other than ordinary. Children are like that. They absorb what adults think they're hiding, and they also have a capacity for living in the present moment that adults mostly lose somewhere along the way. He was eating his Timbit and deciding whether to be a firefighter or a paleontologist. And the fluorescent light in that Tim Hortons was a little harsh, and the booth seat had a small tear in it, and it was one of the better moments of my life. There's something I want to say to anyone who might be watching this, who is in a situation like the one my daughter was in. I know that part of what kept her from reaching out for so long was the feeling that if she told someone, they wouldn't understand, or they wouldn't believe the full picture, or they would tell her she was exaggerating, or she would somehow make things worse. I know that she felt, for a long time, that her safest option was to keep managing it alone. I can only speak for myself when I say, there is no version of this where you reaching out makes things worse. I understand that the situation my daughter was in had particular circumstances. She had a father who happened to have certain training, who happened to have had the foresight to set up a way for her to reach him. And I know that not everyone has that, but the impulse to protect yourself by staying quiet is the same impulse that the Coreys of the world are counting on. That silence is the thing they build their houses on. Whatever your situation is, whatever your resources are, there are people, there are organizations in this country, in every province, that exist specifically to help people navigate exactly what my daughter was going through. Family shelters, legal aid clinics, financial counseling, through organizations like the YWCA. In Ontario, victim services is available around the clock. These are not resources for other people. These are resources for you if you need them. My daughter didn't know how strong she was until she had to be. That's not a cliché. She genuinely did not know. She had been told, in 100 small ways over 4 years, that she was not capable of managing things on her own. She had been told this so many times, and in so many forms that she had started to believe it. She is 31 years old. She is a registered dental hygienist who runs her schedule with more organizational precision than some RCMP detachments I worked in. She is raising her son in a home that is calm, and she is slowly rebuilding the financial independence that was taken from her. And last summer, she went camping with Liam and Britt's family in Algonquin Park. And she sent me a photo of the two of them, sitting by a fire at dusk, with the lake behind them. And the light on the water was extraordinary, and she looked, in that photo, like herself again. That photo is on my refrigerator. As for Corey, I will tell you that the legal process resulted in a peace bond, supervised access to Liam pending a further review, and conditions that made it very clear to him what the consequences of any future contact with Claire would look like. His lawyer made one attempt to have my actions on that November evening characterized as excessive. The Crown didn't agree. Neither did the judge. He knows now who his father-in-law was. I don't know if that matters to him. I suspect it does. Men, like Corey, run on a particular fuel, which is the belief that they are the most significant thing in any given room. The night in November recalibrated something for him. Whether that recalibration holds, whether it means anything about who he will be in the long run, that's not something I can control. What I can tell you is that my daughter is safe, my grandson is happy, and the photo on my refrigerator is one I look at every single morning when I go to make my coffee. I'm 63 years old. I am slower than I was at 35. My right knee tells me about the weather more reliably than any forecast app, and I have had to accept certain limitations that come with being a man of a particular age in a particular body. But I have also learned over 63 years that the people who underestimate experience are almost always younger than experience itself. Corey thought I was just a retired old man who fixed things around the house and didn't understand technology, and had nothing particularly interesting to offer. He wasn't entirely wrong about the technology. He was wrong about everything else.